Shenanigans to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Now, as it starts to get colder up here in the northern hemisphere as we move into the fall and into the winter, some of you that might be laughing at us that have data centers, so those of you who don't have data centers, laughing at us who do have data centers for them being the loud, noisy, space heating monstrosities that they are, you might start to feel a little bit silly right about now as it starts to get colder out, because while you are busy cranking up your thermostat to try to stay warm and cranking that heat, us with data centers at our house, all we have to do is curl up right next to our space heaters and we will be nice and comfy and cozy. So while it might be a detriment in the summertime when it may or may not happen to be upstairs where heat rises, thus making your upstairs a sauna, to put it lightly, come the wintertime, it actually is quite pleasant up there, and you actually are potentially even saving yourself in some heating because your data center is doing that for you. So that's just one thing that I thought I would bring up here. But let's get started with our trivia question for the week. So, what type of cyber attack involves flooding a network or website with excessive traffic to disrupt its normal functioning? So, if you've listened to many of our episodes, you should probably be fairly familiar with what we are talking about here, and hopefully this should be fairly easy for some of you. But regardless, that is the trivia question for the week. Now, this week's cybersecurity tip isn't really much of a tip because, I guess it kind of is, but there was a data breach that happened within the past week that was fairly significant, so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about in this week's cybersecurity tip. So as I kind of alluded to there, really the tip for this week, I guess, is that your personal online security doesn't just affect you in all cases. So yeah, there's some cases where it might just only affect you, but there are other instances where it's not just you that's affected. One immediate example that I can think of off the top of my head is if you potentially share a bank account with someone, maybe you're married or something and you share a bank account, or you have maybe like a child or something that's attached to your bank account for some reason. Regardless, if you have some poor security and someone gets in through one of the subsidiary accounts, they could potentially drain your bank account, which obviously wouldn't be good. Another instance is if you have any kind of, similar to the bank account situation, maybe like I guess credit card's a little bit different, but maybe like a phone plan or something, and someone's able to hack in through a subsidiary account or through your account and then drain money that way. I mean, there's a couple different ways where this can happen, but this one specifically is potentially, I guess depending on how you look at it, potentially even worse. So basically what happened was 23andMe, which, if you're not familiar with 23andMe, they're a service which basically allows you to take a DNA test, and then they can do based on that DNA test, they can do all sorts of things, from tell you like where your ancestry's from, who your relatives are. You can find people. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff you can do it by, basically giving them your entire genetic information. So obviously there have been people that in the security conscious areas of the world that have basically been warning people not to use these, because you're essentially giving your entire genetic information to who knows who to do with who knows what. And some people would say this was inevitable. But there was some sort of data breach that happened, and currently customers of 23andMe are having their genetic information being sold on the dark web now. So, yeah, not a very good situation. And the reason why this is a prime example of your security doesn't necessarily just affect you is because even if you never gave any of your information to 23andMe, you never created an account, you never took any of their DNA tests, anything like that, if you have any relatives that did, well, congratulations, your genetic information is now in the hands of who knows who because of this data breach. So, yeah. Because in case you weren't familiar, if you are the descendant of someone, it's pretty genetic wise. I mean, I think you can see where I'm going here. So you don't even have to be the person that got hacked, yet you still in a way could have been hacked, because if we go into this article here, some of the information that was exposed included full names, usernames, profile photos, sex, date of birth, genetic ancestry results, and geographic location. And also compromised accounts that had opted into the platform's DNA relative feature that allows them to find genetic relatives and connect with them. Yeah, so that's basically telling that, direct link to you, essentially. So if you have any relatives or know anyone close to you like that use this service, there is a good chance that somewhere on the dark web, some attacker has all of your data, genetic data, so even worse. Now, the way that this data was apparently exposed, according to, I guess, the 23andMe, this article is from Bleeping Computer, but I guess the 23andMe spokesperson said that the preliminary results of this investigation suggest that the login credentials used in these access attempts may have been gathered by a threat actor from data leak during incidents involving other online platforms where users have recycled login credentials. So, yeah, here's another cybersecurity tip for you. Don't reuse passwords because just because there was a data leak on one account and you changed your password there, if you use the same password there on other accounts, well, now your other accounts are potentially compromised too, and based on this article and from what this spokesperson said, that seems to be exactly what happened. So yeah, don't reuse passwords. That's probably one of the most basic ways that you can improve your cybersecurity awareness and prevent yourself from being hacked is to not have the same passwords on multiple sites. The easiest way to do this, because passwords are hard to remember, especially if you're creating strong ones, which you should, is to use some kind of password manager. There are plenty of solutions out there, from cloud-hosted ones that you can access from anywhere to self-hosted ones. There's plenty of good ones out there. So reusing passwords or having weak passwords is really not an excuse anymore, because of how readily available good password managers are. But yeah, so the accounts got compromised due to recycled login credentials. So that's kind of a big misstep on those people's parts. Now, I don't want to necessarily make light of a serious topic such as this, but the threat actor that is currently, I guess, selling the data on the dark web is currently offering discounts for people that buy in bulk. So I guess they're just trying to do people a solid. But yeah, so hopefully you or relatives don't use or didn't use 23andMe or any of the other genetic testing sites or companies or whatever, because in the event that they get compromised, you also get compromised even if you had nothing to do with them. So let this, I guess, be a wake-up call to anyone out there that was potentially considering using one of these services. Probably don't, because you have no idea what they're going to do with your data, specifically your genetic information, which is pretty important. I mean, that I would say that's kind of close up there with, like, other personally identifiable information like social security number, licenses, bank account information, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess on the one hand, if this really was just the fact that people were recycling login credentials, in that case, that could be easily prevented. But at the same time, I mean, we've seen companies all over the place get their databases hacked and the data leaked, regardless of if users were getting hacked through bad passwords or something like that. So it's really something that's out of your control. But I would say if you really are keen on doing like some kind of DNA analysis on your genome to find something, like just go to an actual clinic or something with like real medical professionals rather than through some third-party service. But that's just my 2 cents. So yeah, this is a pretty bad data breach. So yeah, be mindful of the types of services and things that you get yourself into, because as seen here, if you get compromised, it might just not be you that gets compromised. You might be potentially compromising people around you as well. And I'm assuming that they would not be very happy with you if by proxy they essentially got hacked because of something you decided to do. But yeah, so 23andMe, that is a big yikes for sure. So that is your cybersecurity tip of the week. Be mindful of your own security, because in some cases, it's not just you that's on the line. It's your friends and family potentially also. So yeah. Oh boy. I mean, the thing of it is, right, like, I mean, personally, I never had any desire to do any kind of genetic test like this, partly because I always just thought it kind of weird of I am giving my entire genetic information to who knows who to do with who knows what. I guess on part of me, that inner I want to make a conspiracy theory type thing was like, I don't want my whole genome out there that I could just, people could make clones of me or something. Obviously, I don't think that would happen for many reasons, partly being ethical reasons. But I guess, I don't actually I can't think of anyone off the top of my head that I know of blood related that has done any of these tests per se. But if any of them did, well, then I guess my hopes and dreams of not signing up for one of these tests because I'm scared of my genome being out there is gone anyway. But yeah, it's just kind of crazy that, people were just willing to give this massive amount of personal information out to some company. I mean, but again, that's coming from me with a biased, cybersecurity background opinion, where you basically don't want to give any personal information out to anyone, regardless of reason. Like, I know for me, like, I don't generally like having to give out, license or passport or social security information or anything like that, even for like bank account related stuff where it's like actually justifiable, or you need to, verify who you are. Even in those cases, I don't like giving out that kind of information. And those are to like, institutions where, they would, in theory anyway, have really good, strong security, but some random, genetic testing company taking all your data like that, I can't fathom of necessarily why. I mean, I guess on the one hand, right, it would be cool to kind of know all that information, who you, like, where you came from, what percentage ethnicity of something are you, that kind of stuff, who you're related to. And it can definitely be really cool, to kind of see your family lineage and stuff, and maybe see if you're related to any like famous people from the past. And I guess that's kind of cool, but I don't know if it's necessarily worth giving your entire genetic information to some company. But people are going to do what they're going to do, right? So there's nothing that we can really do about it. Really, I guess the only thing that we can do is help inform people of what they're getting themselves into, when they would sign up for a service like this. I guess that's really the only thing that we can do, because at the end of the day, like I said, people are going to do what they're going to do. But I guess with that depressingness out of the way, I guess we can get into a little more upbeat stuff with what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I guess last week was pretty much, I didn't really do a whole lot as far as programming, but this week I did get, because, I was focused on all that VLAN fun stuff, and that pretty much took all my time. But this week I had a little bit more time to focus on some programming, which I did get back into. I did continue to modify some of my classes and structs in my video game that I'm making, in order to better align them. So if you'll recall a couple weeks ago, where we talked about the importance of aligning your structs and your classes, and the bit aligning, bit fields, and all that kind of good stuff, and basically trying to optimize the memory footprint to not take up extra data that you don't need because you didn't align your data properly. So I pretty much went through and did some more aligning of my data, and ironically, well, the other thing too was I finally got around to cutting out a bunch of stuff that I didn't need anymore. So part of I talked about how I had this larger Pokemon class, right, and then the smaller one, and now they're basically both the same size because of a couple reasons. One, I went through the original Pokemon class and basically cut out all the stuff that I didn't actually need anymore. So that took out a lot of space, probably close to 100 bytes worth or something like that. Like, it was a good chunk. And then the other space that I was able to gain back was from better aligning the data structure. So that was pretty big. Now, I guess one thing I don't know if I necessarily mentioned back in that episode a couple weeks ago is the general rule of thumb to properly align your data structures, like your structs and your classes and all that stuff, is to put your data types in descending order. So like largest first, then going down to the lowest. And this is not a silver bullet as far as ensuring that you're going to be properly aligned and not take up any extra space. But generally speaking, if you're just dealing with normal standard data types like your ints, your bools, chars, doubles, all that kind of stuff, generally speaking, if you're just dealing with those, you're going to be properly aligned. The only instance where you might not be properly aligned is once you start getting into non-standard data types, so like using other classes or structs in your class or struct, or using fixed-sized arrays, because depending on how big your fixed-sized array is, that potentially could automatically put you off alignment. So I guess one example would be is if you created an array that was, say, I don't know, took up 15 bytes because you made a string that was 15 characters long, you're not going to be properly aligned if you put that and then, another 8-byte object, you're going to have, 1 byte missing there. So there are some instances where going perfectly from largest data type down to the smallest one won't necessarily get you to be perfectly aligned, but generally the rule of thumb is if you go in that descending order, you'll at least be in a better situation than if you kind of just haphazardly threw everything in there. Now, again, you can just take all the hard work out of it. Hard work, I guess, in quotes there, because it's not necessarily all that hard. But, using some kind of attribute tag or doing a pragma and basically telling the compiler to pack the data structure for you. The only problem with that, though, is the compiler doesn't pack it by default because, I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago in that episode, it basically aligning it the way that it does, it makes it more optimized that way. So you telling it to forcibly pack everything together when it otherwise wouldn't be could potentially see some degradation in performance, although you will see a reduction in the memory footprint as far as the how much memory the object would take up either on the stack or if you allocated it on the heap. But ideally, you would want to not do that if you can avoid it. Now, there are going to be some instances where, depending on what kind of data types you're using and the sizes, aligning it properly is going to be really tricky to do. I kind of ran into that a couple of times with some of the classes and stuff that I was running into. But it is just something to keep in mind. So that was kind of what I did. Now, I guess I say this with some caution because there's a chance I might find something else. But now that I think I'm basically done with optimizations, at least for the time being, until I find something else to optimize, I think I can finally move on to actually adding features now. But I guess we'll see what happens. So that was basically the programming stuff. Now, here is where some other fun stuff happened. So I was just minding my own business, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a new server just appeared in my server rack. Now, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I decommissioned, in quotes, a couple servers and freed up some rack space. And I guess some random server on eBay saw that there was now free rack space and was like,
it's free real estate.
And then just appeared to occupy said space. Now, I'm not just going to let it sit there and do nothing, right? Like if a new server just appears in my rack, I'm going to put it to use because, if you come into my house and install yourself in my rack and do nothing? I mean, the audacity of you, server. I'm going to put you to work, because unless your name, server, is xserv, you don't get to just sit in my rack and look pretty, taking up precious rack space. Because seeing that I only have a 15U rack, which to some people be like, man, you can fill that much space. Yes. But that generally maybe not generally, but in the home labbing sphere, 15U is small in some cases, maybe middle of the road, but regardless, rack space is kind of at a premium these days. So if something is going to be in my rack, it better have a purpose and be doing something, unless I said it's an xserv, because the xserv pretty much just gets a free pass because, one, it just looks absolutely incredible. I mean, I wouldn't spend the money on it, but at the same time, I would not be opposed to having an entire rack filled with xservs and xserv raids, not doing anything, but just sitting there as just essentially like a museum piece, if you want to call it that. Now, I guess on the one hand, if you did have an entire server rack full of xservs, I mean, the possibilities are endless, right? Like you could, I mean, you wouldn't need to buy a blow dryer. You wouldn't even need to blow dry your hair, because you could just stand behind the back of your rack and just get absolutely blasted with a bunch of hot air. It'd be great for that. Also, I mentioned, come wintertime when things start to get cold. I mean, if you get cold, just walk behind the rack and you'll warm up. And if you want some rather loud but nonetheless white noise, I mean, what better solution than to have a rack full of xservs, because these guys, they will be loud. Also, I guess, if you don't want to hear anyone else talk, or maybe even hear yourself think, that would be another excellent use for a full rack full of xservs. But regardless, any other enterprise server that isn't named xserv, that is taking up rack space, better be serving a purpose. So yeah, I put this thing to work. Now, as far as what server it was, I guess I didn't mention that. I decided, well, I guess since I'm trying to stick with this this tale here, this story of it just appearing in my rack and I didn't actually buy it. It is a Dell R730XD, which basically the XD just referring to that the front is all drives rather than having any kind of like status information. But anyway, it's 12 large form factor drive bays in the front, or 12 3.5-inch bays on the front, and then it has two 2.5-inch bays on the rear. And basically, as you can probably guess right now, it is going to be replacing, well, I guess at this point, it has replaced my current NAS, or I guess now former NAS, which was the Dell R510. Now, as far as power draw, since that was one thing, basically the main driving factor as to why I wanted to replace the R510, not because it wasn't doing a good job, because it absolutely was. The main reason I wanted to replace it was because of that power draw aspect. Now, the R730, it does draw less power. Not necessarily that much less power. Like, it still draws a decent bit of power, but it does draw less. Now, here is where the copium comes in, because while it does draw less power and it's not as significant as I was kind of hoping for, I also have more drives in it than I did in my R510, which those in themselves draw more power, but I'm also getting more storage. So here's me trying to rationalize my decision, right? So that was pretty much most of my week, which I guess on the one hand, I had a decent amount of downtime, which I was able to get some coding done. But that was a decent amount of my week, was getting that all configured with TrueNAS and getting my old NAS transferred over to the new one, which actually, because I was using TrueNAS, it made it super simple and arguably pretty darn fast too. Because the nice thing was the R730 that I got, I guess it technically didn't come with one, but I made sure to get a network card with 10 gig on it because, of course, I got to have a 10 gig connection on it. And the nice thing was I also bought some DAC cables, or direct attached copper cables, partly for additional 10 gig connectivity, but also I had bought a 10 gig card for my R620 that I had been basically just putting off actually getting an extra cable for it to connect it to a 10 gig link. So part of the reason I got the DAC cables was for that as well. But because I had these, DAC cables, I was able to connect the R510 to the R730 and do a direct 10 gig connection that way, and just copy all the data directly over. And here is where TrueNAS and ZFS are really where they really shine, because I didn't max out the 10 gig connection, but that was because I was maxing out the write speed, or I guess technically the read speed of the R510, and it's 3 drives. So the reason why I was saying that TrueNAS and ZFS are awesome for this is because there's this thing called ZFS replication. I believe that's what it's called. And basically what this allows you to do is take your current pool with all your data sets and everything, and assuming you have snapshots enabled, you can basically create a direct clone of your current instance on a different ZFS system, or TrueNAS system in this case. And basically what it'll do is just copy the differences, because I think we've mentioned this before on the podcast. Basically what a snapshot is in terms of ZFS is basically the difference between basically what the last snapshot was and the current one to basically track changes. So if anything changed, you can have that as a reference. So basically, during the replication process, you're basically just copying over the changes, the differences, if you will. And obviously, if you don't have anything on the server that you're replicating to, it's obviously going to copy everything. But the reason why this is really nice is the way that this replication works is it works on the block level rather than the file level. So if you've ever transferred a lot of files at once, one thing that you'll probably be well aware of is if you have very large files, they tend to transfer pretty quickly, but if you have a lot of small files, they transfer insanely slowly. And the main reason for this is when you're doing a file level transfer, you basically have to read the contents of the file and then send it, and you're basically doing that for each file. So it's kind of slow if you have a lot of files, and that's why larger files go quicker, because you're just sending a constant stream of data rather than send, stop type of a thing. But the reason why the block level transfer is so much faster is because you're basically transferring. You can imagine it as one large file. You're transferring a single large block, and that block could have 100 files. It could have one file. I mean, there could be a bunch of different combinations of everything in between. So because you're just transferring the blocks, you're not concerned at all about the actual file content, so you're able to transfer at much faster rates. So I was basically maxing out the read speed of the 3 drives in the R510, and the reason I know that is because each of those drives, I think, is rated to read at, 120 megabytes per second. And the transfer speed I was seeing was kind of peaking around like 360, which would kind of fall right in line with 3 drives reading all at once. So that kind of made sense. But even still, I mean, that's a heck of a lot faster than if I just tried to copy everything, or if I tried to make an archive, doing like archiving everything like I do when I copy it to my Xserve. It was definitely a lot faster doing the replication that way, which was really awesome to see. And then came the interesting part of all of this. So this entire time, when I was transferring the files between the R510 and the R730, I was copying them with the DAC cables. And this is very important, as you'll soon see, because at this point, when in this saga, the server was not actually in the rack yet. So it was just sitting on the floor next to the rack. And during this process, I had actually got rails for it. And the rails were supposed to be compatible according to the listing, but they actually weren't, so I had to send them back and order a new set of rails. And the new set of rails did actually work, so when the new rails finally came in, I got the R730 in the rack, and I thought, now that everything's transferred over to it, I don't really have to worry about the R510 anymore, so I basically unplugged it and basically swapped the connections over. So the Ethernet cable that was running to the IPMI port, plugged that into the R730. The fiber connection that was running from the R510 to my switch, plugged that into the R730, and then plugged the 2 power cables for the redundant power supplies from the R510 into the R730. So now the R510 is literally just completely unplugged from everything. And then I decided to boot TrueNAS back up now that the R730 was ready to go. And no web interface. Proxmox servers were unable to connect to it, and I was scratching my head, because the R510 used a actual fiber cable. So it was connected with an actual fiber cable and 2 SFP plus transceivers on either end. Now, recall that when I was configuring the new NAS and transferring everything over, I was using 2 DAC cables, or direct attached copper cables, rather than that fiber cable with the 2 SFP plus transceivers. Now, the DAC cables do have SFP plus modules on them. They're just connected via 2 SFP plus modules, but they're not like specific SFP plus transceivers per se that you would have to plug a fiber connection into. It's a little bit different. Once you get into like 10 gig and like fiber, and even beyond 10 gig and all the various types of connectors and all that good stuff, it kind of gets crazy. But I guess what I'll do is I will save you all from the like 3-ish hours of troubleshooting, and just cut to what the issue was. So I plugged the cables in, right? And the interface said, based on TrueNAS's network configuration, that it was configured, but I wasn't able to access the web interface. So after trying to set it to DHCP and delete and re-add the interface, well, actually, part of the problem was I deleted the interface thinking I would just clear it out, and it actually like completely deleted it, and it was like gone. Like it was just gone, like not in the interface. unable to actually reset it. It was just gone. So then I decided, okay, this is not going well at all. I was borderline ready to reinstall TrueNAS actually, until I decided, I was like, okay, I'll do a couple more tests here. I'll plug a direct Ethernet cable from my laptop to the TrueNAS server to get into the web interface, make sure I can do stuff. And again, tried to play around with that. That wasn't working. And again, I kid you not, I literally rebooted the system 2 times trying to get to the initial install setup part of the bootloader, and failed for some reason. I forget why. I was trying to look at something else and wasn't paying attention. And I'm glad I did, because after those 2 attempts, I decided to give one other thing a shot, which was reloading the Ethernet driver for the network card. And when I removed the driver from the kernel and reloaded the driver, I got a beautiful error message saying that the SFP plus or QSFP plus connection was unsupported. So yes, those of you who have dealt with 10 gig connections and specifically SFP plus transceivers are probably well aware of this fact, that certain manufacturers do not play nice with others when it comes to SFP plus transceivers, and some are quite picky on which transceivers they will work with. So yeah, basically 3 hours gone because the new card that I have in the R730 didn't support the SFP plus transceiver that I was using. So yeah, that was a good time. So for whatever reason, the Mellanox, I was using a Mellanox Connect X3. I think that's what it was. Yeah, that 10 gig card in the R510, and it was working without issue. But the card that I have in the R730 is actually an OEM Dell variant from Intel, so it's an Intel card. And I guess for whatever reason, Intel wasn't playing nice with the SFP plus transceivers I had, and I guess they only wanted the Intel variety, so oh well. But it wasn't all for loss, because I ended up just swapping the transceivers with the actual fiber cable and just put that into the R620 as that 10 gig connection, because I know that worked, and plugged that in and that worked fine. So yeah, so that was a lot of headache trying to realize that what the issue actually was. So let this be a cautionary tale to those of you out there. I'm definitely not the first that said this, and I'm pretty sure I won't be the last person that said this. But when it comes to SFP plus transceivers, you kind of got to do your homework, because they can come back and bite you. You got to make sure that the transceivers you're using are compatible with the hardware that you're planning to use them in. Now, some hardware vendors are more lenient than others. There are some that basically take any type of transceiver you want to throw at it, and then there's others that they only want their own kind. Why it's not like standardized, like your standard, RJ45 connector for Ethernet, I honestly don't know, but that's the world we live in. So whenever you decide to get into any of the SFP range, SFP plus, QSFP plus, SFP28, any of those higher end beyond gigabit connections where you're going to be using non-Ethernet cables with your standard RJ45 jack, it's definitely something that you have to do your research on beforehand. But with that said, the one thing that was quite nice about this was I had mentioned for I don't remember when I first got into the 10 gig game. I think it's probably getting close to a year at this point when I first got the 10 gig card for my NAS, I think. But one thing that I had always kind of, I don't know if complained about is the right word, but one thing I've brought up on multiple occasions is the fact that I've never really been able to fully test the capability of the 10 gig connection. But that changed because now that I had two different servers connected via a 10 gig connection and I wasn't bottlenecked by hard drive read speeds, I was able to unleash the power of 10 gig. And so what I did was I decided to run iPerf 3, which if you're not familiar, it's kind of like a networking benchmark to try to test your networking speeds and potentially see if you have any kind of hardware limitations, obviously separate from like hard drives per se, just kind of like see if you maybe have a CPU limitation or something, potentially. But regardless, it's basically a way that you can test your network speed between two computers. Anyway, I decided to give that a run on my R620 as the client and the new NAS, the R730, being the server. And my goodness, seeing that fully saturated 10 gig connection, oh man, it was glorious. Seeing it output in the console, like 9.9 or 9.8 gigabits per second, which is basically maxed out at that point. And then seeing in the TrueNAS web UI, seeing like 1.12 or something gigabits per second, or not gigabits, gigabytes per second being transferred. Ooh, it was so good. Man, I was such a happy man seeing that full 10 gig saturation finally. Now, the real test, which is going to be interesting, I haven't seen it yet, is how my backups are going to work, because my Proxmox servers back up all the VMs to the TrueNAS server. So now that the R620 has its main interface set to that 10 gig interface, in theory, it should be doing all the backups over that 10 gig link to the TrueNAS server, which is also a 10 gig link. So I am very curious to see how quickly it's able to go through the backup process. Now, I potentially might get rudely awakened in the middle of the night when it happens, because before I was being bottlenecked by the 1 gig transfer speed. But even with that, I would sometimes kind of hear the server ramp up a little bit as it's, fully saturating that connection and writing all the data. So I'm wondering, with it now being 10 gig and potentially this, in theory, the CPU working even harder now that it's trying to fully saturate that connection, because my R620 has basically two sets of mirrored. It's basically running in a RAID 10. It's running two drives in a RAID 10, which basically, and they're SSDs. So they shouldn't have any issue saturating a 10 gig link. So it's going to be up to the CPUs to keep up. And that means they're probably going to get warm trying to, send all that data through. So I will be interested to see if I get rudely awakened in the middle of the night as that backup job goes. But nonetheless, it should be interesting to see how quickly it goes. And I am definitely looking forward to that. But what I'm not looking forward to is, and what you might not be looking forward to, is this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast coming to an end. Which I have to say, I don't think I've had a transition to the end of an episode that smooth in months. Like, usually my transitions are pretty much abrupt because I can't figure a way to smoothly end it, but this time I did. But of course, before we end, we must get back to our trivia question for the week, and that is, What type of cyber attack involves flooding a network or website with excessive traffic to disrupt its normal functioning? Now, if you said a denial of service or a distributed denial of service attack, congratulations, you are correct. Now, the reason I accepted both of those is because the question, depending on how you interpreted it, either one could have sufficed, because distributed denial of service attack is basically just, coming from essentially like a botnet all over the place attacking, versus a denial of service attack isn't necessarily included in that. It could all be coming from one place. So they both basically could, in this case, achieve the same thing. So if you said either one, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And that is going to do it. So if you enjoyed, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, share with friends and family members. If you have any questions, I love hearing from you guys. So reach out with any questions or comments you have about this episode or topics for future episodes at contact@darkassassins.inc.com. You can always click the link down in the show notes below for that. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.